Jim Callaghan had lost, Margaret Thatcher was the winner, and we had been warned by the Chief of Staff that because the incoming government had been very frustrated for the previous 2 years by this informal alliance between the small Liberal Party and the Labour Party, Margaret Thatcher was very likely to want to change the working structure in 10 Downing Street. So after we'd gone through the formalities of seeing off the outgoing Prime Minister and greeting the incoming Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff, who had been at Buckingham Palace with the outgoing one, came back with the new one after she'd kissed hands, came down to us and said that the news was a little unexpected. Margaret Thatcher's impatience was not about changing personnel, it was about changing policies. And until somebody convinced her otherwise, she was assuming that the 6 of us in the private office were the levers of power, and she was keen to get her hands on the levers of power. So there I was for the next 3 years plus, as one of the private office team for 2 years dealing with domestic policy issues, and in my last year running her briefing for what were then the twice weekly Prime Minister's Question Times sessions in the House of Commons. It was a fascinating job to do. She was a fascinating lady to work with closely.
Not at all strident or threatening.
Very strident and threatening to people one remove, but to the people who were in the immediate entourage, she was kindness itself. And there are a couple of little examples that are worth a mention. There was always one of us was always on duty over weekends, and early in her term, probably 3 weeks into it, she was going to spend a weekend at Chequers, the official Prime Minister, the Camp David, if you like, of the British Prime Minister. And I was the duty private secretary that weekend, and the Chief of Staff said to me, "I think you better be on site at Chequers this weekend. We don't know how all this is going to work out." So Chequers is a 19th century country manor house, and there's a stable block where a small cottage had been created for a private secretary in a previous incarnation. So I went down there and took my wife and my 2-year-old child. Now, both Margaret Thatcher and Michael Pattison were quite unsure what the ground rules were for this arrangement. So there was a call on Sunday morning, or probably on Saturday afternoon. Mike, would you and Beverly like to come over for a drink on Sunday morning? So we sort of tidied ourselves up and walked across to the big house for pre-lunch drinks on Sunday morning, just with Margaret Thatcher and Dennis, and we hadn't really got to know one another at all well by then. And so whilst the 4 of us were just sort of sensing what the ground rules were, my 2-and-a-bit-year-old daughter, born in New York, not at all sure where she was looking around for something to play with. And in the main reception room in Chequers, there aren't many toys for 2-and-a-bit-year-olds. So my daughter Jenny eventually decided, well, the best available toy was dangling from the Prime Minister's ears, and climbed up on Margaret Thatcher's knee and started pulling at her earrings. The Prime Minister was completely unfazed and continued sipping her whiskey and water, I think.
Did she have her own family?
She had twin son and daughter, Mark and Carol, and I saw something of them in one role and another over those 2 or 3 years. And then another little anecdote, because my time in number 10 came to an end. I was supposedly on a 2-year secondment to the central government machine. It had got extended to something over 3, and the last 3 months Downing Street turned into a one-issue office because of the Falklands War. And my job was basically still to work out what MPs were going to ask her in Parliament and make sure she was prepared for it. Quite complicated at that time. But finally, my extended secondment had an end date set. And so on a Friday in June, I was to have my last day in number 10. And there was a convention that a private secretary leaving number 10 would give a few drinks basically for the secretarial team who supported us, and for maybe a few close colleagues from the senior ministerial offices that were close by. So I had arranged to have a couple of glasses of white wine on Friday evening in high summer in 1979. Came into the office that morning to find reports that the Union Jack was being run up over Government House in Port Stanley, i.e. the war was now at an end. So suddenly, through that morning, Downing Street let down its hair collectively and prepared to get back into normal mode, and everybody felt like they needed a bit of celebration. Mm-hmm. So how are they going to celebrate? Well, Pattison was having a drink in the garden this afternoon, so maybe we should all clamber aboard that. So my little farewell party became Downing Street's moment of relaxation, and Margaret Thatcher came down to join it. And when Beverly and Jenny, our daughter by then 5, arrived, I didn't spot this, but Beverly did. Margaret Thatcher saw Jenny, went over to her and quietly took her away to a garden seat some way away from there where everybody was gathered, and sat down and had a woman-to-woman talk with my 5-year-old daughter.
I think she was looking forward to grandchildren.
Whatever, yes, that may be part of it. So at the time, Beverly had said to me, I want to bring a camera for this afternoon. I said, no, that's really not done. You shouldn't bring a camera. I've not been allowed to forget that incident.
Because everyone else had cameras.
Yeah. So there's no picture of that occasion, but there are touches like that. On a wider scale, she was, without question, the most significant figure in British politics in the second half of the 20th century. Once the Second World War was over, Churchill was past his prime, Attlee was a significant figure in a different way, but Margaret Thatcher was the dominant political personality of her time. She was very divisive at the time.
But her closeness to us, or
because she was challenging the status quo and the rather soft-centered consensus of managed decline that Britain was facing, and she was willing to challenge that. She was brave in doing that. At the time she came into office, there was a question mark about whether her own party really believed in it. And right through the time that I was working for her, the general consensus was she was going to be a one-term prime minister, Britain's Jimmy Carter, in a way.
And Michael, just to enforce that, do you remember the comment, the recollection of the dinner table conversation about someone said to her, what advice would you give to your children during these bad times? And she said, immigrate.
Yeah, sure. Well,
it was that bad.
But
people leaving for jobs and
yeah, and the government took an anti-Keynesian view of deflating in recession in 1981, 81. So it was, times were tough, but I think that
anti-Dickensian.
Well, Dickensian says you boost your economy, you boost public spending into a recessionary mode, right? The Keynesian tradition. And her government basically did the opposite in the 1981 budget, which cut back at a time when the economy was suffering, jobs were suffering. Highly controversial, and yet I think even her firmest opponents had a admiration for her at one level or another, and her successors on the Labour side, Tony Blair in particular, and Gordon Brown, never aimed to disguise their respect for what she's achieved. She's also very strongly Atlanticist in her outlook, a great believer in the UK-US relationship.
Got criticism for that too.
Well, only to a limited degree. I don't think there is a British instinct which always deals more comfortably with its relationship with the larger English-speaking neighbour than with those foreign voices across the channel. And instinctively, she was a little bit like that, I suppose. Although she was a very effective leader within Europe and in handling the British portfolio in Europe. She was much more forthright than European politicians tend to be. She was a very, very considerable figure, and it was a great privilege to work for her. What people tend to forget, because the image of the Iron Lady comes particularly from the post-Falklands War era, is that in the period when I was working for her in 79 to 82, she was assumed to be a one-term aberration from the norm. And then two things happened, basically. The Falklands War, which made a big difference. And although the electoral arithmetic worked out massively in her favour, it wasn't through a huge increase in her vote. It was that the threat to her in 1981-82 was coming from a new third force in British politics. And the Falklands War just saw that melt away, so that she won more easily in 83 with very little of an increase in her vote than people had been expecting, because the third party, the Liberal, or the Social Democratic group as it was, working with the Liberals, which had been seen as a third force that might come into power in an election in 83 or 84, just dissolved more or less at that point.
And people used to say it was sort of tough love. You know, she loved her country, but she was pulling it up by its bootstraps, and it might cause pain in a lot of ways. But
Sounds like Reagan.
it worked.
Well, and she and Reagan were a great double act, and they.
You went to Washington with her when Reagan was in office, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. But I went to on two Washington visits with her. Actually, the meetings with Reagan were in Cancun, but also.
Did you get to sit on those, or?
Yes, well, not with the Reagan. I actually sat in meetings with Jimmy Carter in late '79. When the end of the Carter presidency and the Iran hostage crisis was there, and that was fascinating. But it was that's American politics.
They had British subjects as captives too in Iran, didn't they?
There were not
Not in the group.
not in that group. I mean, there's a lot of people are revisiting all that with the Argo movie, and I haven't completely caught up with that. Because we still had diplomatic relations with Iran at the time. Our hostage problems were after the Iraq issue, when they had British hostages in Kuwait, when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, I think. Anyway, I've probably given you far too much, so is there anything else in specific?
That's the structure.
Let him ask questions.
Yeah.
I just wanted to hear more about your personal interplay with her, because
Remember after
she
events,
was-
you put her feet up on the coffee table with you guys, and how she was with Dennis, and things like that?
Well,
also that, and also the official, how
well, I
you
was going to
worked
tell you
officially.
a little bit more. I mean, I guess there are two things I can talk about. One is that in the first couple of years, quite a lot of what I was dealing with was fielding correspondence for her, as well as looking at domestic policy issues that were coming into her. And she came from a small business background. Her father was a grocer in a rural town called Grantham in eastern England, in Lincolnshire. And the people who represented that small business class in England had seen her as their great saviour when she came into office. Then came the tough budget measures, and these people were writing in despair to Margaret Thatcher saying, why are you doing this to us? And she found that very, very difficult. She was convinced by the people she'd worked with in opposition that she needed to take a tough line on macroeconomics. But faced with the micro impact on individuals, that was very tough. So I had to find the right line, strike the right note for her in letters back to these people in which she would express her understanding and sympathy. But basically, the famous phrase from her conference speech in one of those years, "The lady's not for turning," she wanted to justify her position. The other thing was the process I went through for the last 12 months or so of the job I was doing. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she was going to be answering questions in the House of Commons live for 15 minutes. And I was responsible for managing the preparation process. So the night before, I would put in her overnight red box the questions that were likely to be reached on the order paper. You know, the questions have been put in 3 weeks ahead of time. So you see what the questions are. But in those days, the question was nearly always, will the Prime Minister state her engagements? Because the convention in question time was when you have had a question answered, you get one shot at a follow-up. But your follow-up has to be germane to the question you've asked. Mm-hmm. So if you put down a question on policy, you don't know where it's going to be 3 weeks' time. Mm-hmm. If you put down a question about the Prime Minister's engagements, then it's perfectly legitimate for you to get up afterwards and say, in the course of her busy day, will the Prime Minister consider? And you've got open season on anything. So the job is to work out what are the hot topics of the day, and in particular, what is the leader of the opposition going to come up with? And then, having done that overnight, you go and see her with her press secretary and her parliamentary aide at 8 o'clock, 8:30 the next morning, just to pick up on the overnight news and check what the main subjects for the day are. And then from about 12:30, I'd go up to her study. There'd be two other people there, her parliamentary aide, who is another political figure, and the Conservative advisor. We'd sit down, we'd have lunch on our knees, and we'd work through the 6 topics that I have concluded with input from others are the hot topics of the day, and 6 reserved topics, because there are always a few people who will come out of the blue, because after the questioner has had his follow-up, anybody else can get up using the same entry, and the speaker will call 2 or 3 of those and then go on to the next questioner. Now, those on the Conservative side who are hoping to be called will almost certainly have alerted you beforehand of what they're going to raise, but the opposition figures, you have no clue, and you know who they are, you're trying to work them out, and particularly you're trying to work out what the leader of the opposition is going to choose for the day. And I knew his chief aide, and we'd occasionally talk, and sometimes they give us a little bit of alert that they really want to focus on something, or they try to catch us out from time to time.
Attack, really.
Yeah.
But
But
watch them. The speakers are wonderful. I keep when I watch the speaking and questioning, I wonder why aren't our politicians so articulate? They're very
Sure.
aiming differently. They don't want to be articulate. They want to be middle of the road, bland, so nobody takes offense.
well, there's got to be a very noisy event. But the point about it was that after we would do this job over in the study in 10 Downing Street until about 2:15 or so, and then we'd get into a couple of official cars, drive 400 yards into the Palace of Westminster, go up to the Prime Minister's office in the House of Commons, which is just behind the Speaker's chair, and continue there until about 3:10. And she'd then go into the chamber and catch the mood a little bit before her 15 minutes of questions come up. But the point was, we'd done our homework pretty thoroughly on these 6 topics that we think are top of the agenda, and we got a little bit of background prepared. And she'd take quite a lot of notes with her, which she'd have loosely in her folder, but she didn't actually need them. Her memory was very good, her self-confidence was very good. At the time, the leader of the opposition was a splendid old-time Labour figure called Michael Foot, but he wasn't very effective at parliamentary question time. And so she was nearly always on top of things, and she had the notes there as a prop, but didn't refer to them. She'd read out her prepared answers for the key questions, but the rest she'd just play it by ear, because she'd really, in those 3 stages of preparation, she was absolutely clear about what she was going to do.
Yeah, that's the main thing about her.
but the only one occasion in my 12 months of doing this prep role where she stuttered was quite interesting, because she was asked by somebody on the opposition benches about crime statistics, and she suddenly doubted herself for a moment, because it was being suggested that the crime figures under her prime ministership for the previous 2.5 years, or the last 12 months, were actually worse than in the last year of Jim Callaghan's. Now, she, in her mind, knew the answer, but suddenly lost confidence. So she started to give the answer, and then went to her folder of papers to try and pull out something she'd been carrying for 4 weeks from one of these briefing sessions, and we hadn't refreshed her mind since then. And she stuttered a bit. And at that moment, Jim Callaghan, who had been booed every time he stood up in the House of Commons for the last 2 years, stood up and was cheered and sort of rehabilitated in parliamentary debate, because he was able to follow up. And she'd lost the plot on that moment. So when she came back from that, there was a little bit of an inquest and decision that we're not going to carry too many old sheets of paper in, because she'd have been far better if she'd stuck to her guns rather than suddenly trying to pick up the memory from the past. She was you couldn't soft soap with Margaret Thatcher. You've got to you had to confront the issues. You know, she wasn't prepared to fiddle around the edges. Well, that's it, really. That's the story, I think.
Now, when you said you left in '82, was that was there like a time limit on your time there?
Yes, I mean the Prime Minister's office has no permanent staff. Everybody's there is seconded from elsewhere, and it's a term process. So I was on a 2-year secondment, and it had got extended, and it ended up being just over 3 years, and that was the end.
Could have extended it some more if she wanted to.
Yes, but it's very interesting. She did. There's a man called Charles Pole who came in just after I finished to take the Foreign Affairs brief, and he remained from late '82 until Margaret Thatcher finished his premiership, her premiership, because she decided to keep him on. I mean, he became a very close personal advisor and friend of the Prime Minister. I wasn't in that category, so I didn't claim this. And the job I was doing was one in which there was a regular turnover, and people did 2 or 3 years in it. But a great privilege to have done it.
Any contact with her after she left?
On a couple of occasions, but I hadn't actually. Well, she's actually been very unwell and really out of circulation for 6 or 7 years. I saw her a couple of times later in the '80s when she was still fit and active and fine, but I haven't been part of it. Yes, she was, and she was in the House of Lords and still hugely popular on the Conservative Party circuit. I mean, past Prime Ministers have to limit their interventions in current business in the same way as past Presidents do, but they're still figures of great stature and great appeal, as she remained.
She seems like a towering figure, Churchill-like, and not as spanning the time as he did, but...
Yeah, I mean, Churchill had a much longer political career, of course, and in a different environment. I mean, he, if you like, turned the tide of history over the Nazi rise in Europe. She changed the economic history of Britain in her time by her strength of will, I suppose, and her individual and maybe quite strident political style, but it was one that a majority of Britain was prepared to respond to at the time. And I think historians will still say her judgment call on what was needed by the British economy at the time was right. I guess over time there may be a view that Britain could have occupied a stronger place in Europe if she had more clearly stood behind the European ideal, rather than being a persistent challenger of the way in which the French and German leadership were driving Europe. She was always standing a little bit aloof from the European adventure, and Britain's relationship with Europe is still unresolved 30 years on. Maybe there was an opportunity for Margaret Thatcher to make it stronger, but that wasn't her priority. She was much more interested in making sure Britain wasn't being milked by France for the benefit of French farmers, essentially.